Thank you so much for being here today, Heather, on the Mindful Impact podcast. I want to ask you the question I ask everybody when they first come on is when you wake up in the morning today in your life, what is it that just lights you up inside? Like just makes your heart sing out loud for the day?
That's such a beautiful question. I would say first and foremost is my marriage, and following right behind is my work.
And let's give the audience, the people listening, a little background on you. Who's Heather? Where did your Business Miracles company start? How did you get into that? Let's talk about that a little bit.
All right, I will try to have it be as concise as possible. It's practically a 20-year journey now. So
Wow.
I've been self-employed for almost 20 years. And I entered into the world of being self-employed, coming from the world of being a high school teacher. So it was quite a shift, but the shift took place around 9/11. And I lived in New York City at the time where I still live. And that pivotal moment for the world definitely was a pivotal moment for me. And though I loved my work and I loved my students, I knew that I was meant to be like sharing my teaching talents on a bigger scale or platform, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So I started my first business as a nutrition and wellness coach. And then I transitioned into what I referred to at that time as spiritual business coaching, which has a whole story to it. And I'm happy to share if that makes sense. And then about 10 years ago, I hit another pivotal point in my process and journey. And in retrospect, can say it was definitely a dark night of the soul. And though I was creating a lot of success in my business at the time, I was really finding myself just, personally out of sorts. I was massively overwhelmed. I was overworked. I was overexhausted. And that is what led me to understand that I am highly sensitive. And I had never even heard that phrase at that time. But once I understood what it meant to be a highly sensitive person, there was so much that started to click and to really make sense to me. And I realized that I would really have to start going about everything in my life very, very differently. And that included being self employed. And as I started that part of my own process, that eventually led to mentoring other highly sensitives who also feel the desire to be self employed. And that has now expanded into highly sensitives who feel the call to have a real empowerment experience for themselves, whether they're self employed or not. And that is the expansion of my work into what I now refer to as highly sensitive leadership. So we
Yeah.
offer leadership training for highly sensitives and multiple areas, everything from self-care to relationships to marketing to visionary to professional. And that's the scoop.
Wow. That was like I mean, you've obviously shared that before because it was well put together, and we know a little bit about Heather for anybody that doesn't know her on here, and there's a few things in there that I want to touch on. The first is you said that you felt a calling to share this on a bigger platform, share your teaching. How how does one like how were you well, you're a sensitive person, so that's probably why. But how did you like know that? Was there like one day you're driving to school and all of a sudden you had a light bulb? I mean, what was it?
Well, again, I would say, though I wouldn't have been able to name it at the time, in retrospect, 9/11 again had a massive impact, right? Especially for those of us in New York City. There was this real kind of awakening of like, okay, wait, like, what am I doing with my life? And if I, want to make a change, do it now, right? It's that kind of, when you have a real, massive catalyst. And that definitely was. So I would say that played a part for sure. It just had all of us thinking, and again, especially those of us who lived in the city, just thinking and reflecting and, just looking at life a little bit differently. I would say very, very similar to what we're all experiencing now in the midst of the global pandemic, of 2020. So that played a part. And then other than that, I would say yes, because I am highly sensitive, which I did not know at the time. But one of our strengths as highly sensitives is that we are extremely intuitive. So I've done a lot of work and a lot of training in regards to the power of intuition and, how to really utilize that as a true strength, as an actual tool. So I really felt it. I really felt like in my core that I was meant to be doing something else. And believe me, I was questioned. I was questioned for sure. I was a tenured teacher. I worked in a special school in New York City at that time where the business partner that I was fortunate to have as part of the program that I worked in was Bette Midler. I worked very closely with her. She questioned me. So believe me, I was questioned, but
and you ignored them.
I wouldn't say I ignored it, but the calling was stronger.
Wow.
So I took a risk and took that step and was totally terrified, completely terrified. I do not want to make it sound in any way like this was a walk in the park, not at all. But again, the calling was bigger than the fear.
And you would have never, like looking back at it, you've never changed a thing with that decision.
I would not change a thing with
Yeah.
that decision.
There, yeah, you're the third person in the 15 months this podcast has been running that the 9/11 that has created a catalyst for a jump into something different, and
Yes.
and that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I hear this so much. Just to kind of reiterate what you said, is you had, I mean, looking from the outside, you had it going on. You know what I mean? Like your tenure, you're teaching, you're working with Midler. It's just, you're in New York City, and but you felt so strongly that there was something bigger for yourself, something more impactful that you could do for others, and did it. That's, and I hear that a lot. It's just scary to leave something that comfortable and jump in. Okay, so highly sensitive. You said intuition's one thing. All right. I want to get right into this. So on Heather's website, right before we jumped on, there's a quiz on there you guys could take to figure out if you're a highly sensitive entrepreneur or person.
Yes.
Right. And there's a series of questions you go through to figure it out. And for people listening, if you jump on and do that, you probably haven't ever, like you said, you never even heard that term before, and you realize, wow, that's me. When I think of an entrepreneur, right? This is why this is like totally cool to dive into with you, Heather. I think of like networking, go-getter, outgoing, eccentric, a little weird, high achiever, right? And then I'm like, oh, someone highly sensitive, there's no way they could ever deal with this. Like they would just fall apart, right? Is my initial thought process. If I sat and ruminated with it for a while, I definitely would understand. So I think it's so cool because what are some other characteristics of a highly sensitive person? How does that play as an advantage to them in business and relationships?
Right. Well, first I'll say you're spot on. That is the natural deduction of like, absolutely no way can you be highly sensitive and successful in business. And that was definitely my experience, in my first almost 10 years. I didn't know anything about being, self-employed. So I attended trainings, I hired coaches, and I just did what they told me to do. And it nearly killed me, right? And that's what led me to understand that I was highly sensitive. But
Mm,
what I knew was I knew that I was really good at what I did. I knew that I was a really, really positively impactful coach. I knew that I was an excellent teacher. So I didn't have any doubts about the, actual service that I was providing. It was all of the, how do I bring this out into the world? And again, doing it in that mismatched way was, really, really physically and, emotionally detrimental. So that's what
mm,
led me to that inquiry, that deep inquiry, which then again led me to the fact of understanding that I'm highly sensitive. But the deep inquiry was like, I don't know if this is what you have to do to be successful in business, and I'm not really sure this is for me. And if I don't do this, and what am I going to do? Because I knew that I could go back to the classroom, but I didn't feel like that was where I was meant to I wasn't meant to go back to that environment. So what I really came to understand as I studied and researched and received training and support about what it meant to be highly sensitive is I started to see, oh, this makes sense. There are certain strengths that we possess as highly sensitives, which makes sense that we've been called to these service-based businesses. And especially within this new century, right? If we look back 20 years ago, even coaching was barely a thing. So a lot of highly sensitives feel called to service-based businesses like coaching, like being a therapist, like law. My work again has extended far beyond more of those kind of maybe first stereotypical groups of highly sensitives. And yet, every single person who comes into my leadership training programs has like a base similarity that they hold these strengths, which support them in being really, really good at working with people,
mm.
as long as they go about it in a different way than what I like to refer to as the other 80%. Because according to the research, there's 20% of us who are born into the world highly sensitive. So we can take these strengths and actually apply them to be very successful leaders, whether that's, again, whether that's just simply how you show up at the dinner table, or whether it's how you show up in your business, or whether it's how you show up in the boardroom. But you have to be willing to go about it differently, which means that you need to not buy into the story that the only way to create success is the hustle. And the minute you can start to shift that story and the other elements that come along with that story, then there's a whole world that opens up in terms of how you can and are meant to do it differently as a person who's highly sensitive.
Yeah. So I think that people who aren't aware that they're highly sensitive, I would say that they might think of some of the traits as weaknesses in their life,
Yes,
right? Do
definitely.
you run into that?
Oh, for sure. And especially when I first again learned that I was highly sensitive, I've always worked with a guiding principle that your ideal client is a version of you. So I brought in a highly sensitive assessment to a group of 25 women that I was working with at that time. It was an in-person meeting. I had them all take the assessment. Every single woman in that room was highly sensitive, and not one woman in that room wanted to be highly sensitive. They absolutely saw it as a weakness, as a detriment. And that's when I knew at that point, I was like, oh, like this is the work that I'm really meant to do. Because all of these women who were in that room at that time, very, very talented. So I knew that they could absolutely be successful,
Mhm.
and not despite the fact that they were highly sensitive, but because they were highly sensitive. It was just going to take a shift in perception from that this is a weakness to actually these are strengths. That when I use them as strengths, everything is so much easier for me. And I'm actually able to be a better service because of it.
Heather, can you give me an example, maybe of a client you worked with or yourself, like one of those traits that they used as a strength and how it changed their business or changed their family dynamic, whatever? Can you give us an example?
Absolutely. Yes. So when it comes to business, the first real key shift for highly sensitives is how to go about the selling conversation. So for non-highly sensitives, when you train and you study and you learn how to have a selling conversation, it tends to be on the track of, really setting up the prospect to understand that they need to make this decision now. And if they don't make this decision now, then there's something that's going to be lost. And often time pressure is a part of that. And all of that does not work for those of us who are highly sensitive. So one, we don't perform well under pressure. And two, we tend to be very deep thinkers, deep feelers, and deep listeners. Those are 3 of the top 12 strengths that I've identified. So I reconfigured how to have a selling conversation so it really plays to those strengths. And the minute I started using that process, my conversion rate really shifted and changed. The more other highly sensitives that I taught the process to, their conversion rate shifted and changed. So I just have story upon story upon story of self-employed, highly sensitive entrepreneurs who, have gone from like no clients to full practices, right? Who conversion rates went from 20% to 80%. Too many to really like honestly directly share. So that's just one example when it comes to business. And then I have tons of other examples that I'm happy to go into when it comes to relationships, how to work with teams, et cetera, et cetera. You just
Yeah.
let me know
Okay.
what you want.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I literally have like a million questions about that, but I want to go right into the relationships, like you said, because taking your, and I said this before I pressed record here, taking your quiz online. I've been married for 8 years. I have a 5-year-old son, a 2-year or 5-year-old daughter, a 2-year-old son, and I was doing the questions and I was like, that's my wife. That's my wife. That's my wife. When I was a no, there were so many yeses that she was. And I know that because she actually has used the term that she's a highly sensitive person. And I just kind of was like, okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, you are sensitive, but I didn't realize there was a whole category for it, like an
Uh,
actual
uh,
lifestyle kind of, right?
well,
Um,
yes, and it's more than a lifestyle, but I'll say more about that in a minute. So,
okay.
go ahead.
So now she has to deal with me, who's an Enneagram 7, if you're familiar with Enneagrams at
Yeah.
all. And high achiever, go getter, emotions, push them away, like only happy and I'm, through I'm a meditation teacher too. So, and so I'm like learning how to actually process these emotions and sit with them and allow them, and it's making me such a better human, and for myself and for others, a lot more connections, right? So how, what do you see as like a struggle between those two, and how two types of people, and how do they coexist a little better, a little stronger?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, first of all, my husband also is not highly sensitive. So I definitely personally understand and know very, very well the dynamic between one spouse who is not highly sensitive and one spouse who is highly sensitive. And I will say that understanding that I'm highly sensitive absolutely, completely revolutionized our marriage for the better 1,000%.
Mm.
Um, from there, I'll say it's not just a lifestyle. So I'm just going to take a moment to reference some of the research. So, being a highly sensitive person, there's a lot of psychology based research in regards to what it means to be a highly sensitive person. Dr. Elaine Aron is the person, or the researcher, I should say, who's most well known because her research from the early 90s, she published into a book called The Highly Sensitive Person.
Ooh.
But according to all of the research is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's 20% of us who are born into the world highly sensitive. So I always like to say, it's not something that your parents did to you and you didn't pick it up on the playground, and it's not
Ah.
because of that weird drink that you had in college. It literally is biologically how you were brought into this world. And what it means is your nervous system is wired to take in stimulation at a much higher degree than someone who's not highly sensitive. So that can be anything from sight, sound, smells, energy, information. Your nervous system is like a fine-tuned antenna. So something that would be like maybe slightly stimulating for someone who's not highly sensitive, you can think maybe rock concert will be like over the top stimulating for a highly sensitive. So that's first and foremost. So when your wife says to you, like, I'm a highly sensitive person, it's not something that she just kind of was like, oh, I think I'm going to say this is what I am, right? It literally is like how she processes the world. Now, as I said, my husband is not highly sensitive. And I always kind of think of us like the tortoise and the hare, because he is like, he just moves like super, super quickly. He processes thoughts quickly. He comes up with ideas quickly. He literally walks faster than I do. He like, his music is loud. I mean, we could just go on, and everything for me is slower. Like it takes me a lot longer to kind of like process something, or, you know, I have to sit in a different place in a restaurant, back when we used to eat in restaurants, all kinds of differences in terms of, again, how we experience the world. Why this made such a difference, understanding this, was because once I understood it and then my husband understood it, what we were able to come to together is this is more than just personal preferences. This is literally like, I am having a different experience than you are. So we need to find the language to help each other understand the different experience each of us is having and find our middle ground. And this is an aspect that I teach in my leadership training programs called difficult conversations, right? Like how to show up and have difficult conversations where you're able to talk about, you know, your differences. You're able to talk about issues that would be potential conflicts. You're able to come to negotiation in a different way because you're able to depersonalize it to a degree. It's not me against you, but it's literally, again, this is how you process. This is how I process. What can we co-create together? So I hope all of that is helpful in regards to at least beginning to speak to, you know, how you can show up as a leader within your relationships as a person who's highly sensitive.
Yeah, that's a great referencing point, starting point, understanding point to go from. And I had a lot of like, that makes sense as you were saying that. Totally. You know, and just one example, it would be like, you know, when my son is smashing the drum, like the little toy drums, and I have music on, and and she's doing the dishes or whatever, just for an
Right.
example, and she'll turn around and go, this is just too much noise for me, I can't, like, and
Right.
I'm like, and I'm dancing around like I can, like, you know, like this, not like, what do you mean it's too much noise? Okay, I understand if you're sensitive, so that like it's just plain as day with
Right, exactly. Where that's like energizing for you, but
yeah.
literally her nervous system is being flooded. So it's being flooded to the degree, most likely, I don't want to speak for your wife, but most likely where she's literally not able to like be fully present
Yeah,
and
100%.
process what's happening because it's literally too much.
Yeah.
It's that is where one of our shadows of overwhelm comes from, and all kinds of other shadows that stem from there as well.
Yeah, and I think it's so. I think the topic is so brilliant to explore because it just gives you, again, you said new perspective, right? And it allows the other people that understand it to have a new perspective. Um,
Right.
I'm always trying to, relationship wise, connect on a deeper level with our partner, right? With my partner, and I think I'm buying this book right away so I can understand it a little. Do you have a book?
I do not yet have a book.
Yet.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, it's literally in process as we speak. But I
Cool.
do recommend Dr. Aaron's book, and definitely, commend you for wanting to buy it, because it truly does make a difference to more deeply understand. And what I'll say is that, again, that example with your wife is such a great example, because for most highly sensitives, they haven't been taught, right? Like how to work with their nervous system, because we are that smaller percentage of the world. So many highly sensitives then feel as if they are a victim to the onslaught of the stimulation that the world has, or is their experience of the world, I should say. So that's really where my work comes in. Like I said, I started first with entrepreneurs, which is, you don't have to be a victim to your nervous system, but you do need to learn how to work with it differently. And so that is the entire retraining process. And once you do, then you enter into a state of empowerment. And that's where, again, the work then expands into leadership, where you can show up in your family. For example, again, your wife is an excellent example, feeling more empowered to lead as a member of the family who's highly sensitive, rather than, oh, I just have to like cope with this. And I have a whole teaching on what I refer to as coping mechanisms, which get you by, but don't have you in a real, like, genuine, deeply satisfying, life, relationship, work experience. You're literally just coping, and there's so much more that's available to us than only coping, and feeling like, again, the world is happening to us. It doesn't need to be that way.
Interesting perspective there. Yeah, and it's yeah. I'm my brain's just going like, and it's very hard for somebody like myself, to put myself in those shoes, because I can't understand that. So to
That's
listen
so
to you
true.
speak makes my mind like, whoa, oh, this
Yeah,
makes sense. This makes sense. This
yeah,
makes sense. And
yeah.
it's a beautiful thing. Like there's just I love it. What it makes me think like I'm internet marketer too. So I had like on a sales funnel now, I want to put like a pre-page, a lander that's like, are you highly sensitive? Yes or no. And then like if they are yes, they're going to go to a different sales funnel. And if they're no, they're going to go to another sales funnel.
Very true. Yeah, that will really, really support you.
That's
Yes.
great. Interesting. I just don't know how to close a highly sensitive person yet. I don't know the exact procedure. I'll have to sign up on your course to figure
Yeah,
that
I'm
out.
happy to teach you.
So what is it seems like, well, let me ask you this actually, since you're in New York City, do you live like in Manhattan, like the actual,
Yes,
you have an
Manhattan.
apartment there?
Yes, yes, yes. And actually, just new in my life is all of the living changes that have been forced upon me because of COVID. Pre-COVID, my husband and I lived in a full service building in Manhattan. We lived in an open concept apartment. And in the first days of the pandemic, he at that time was still serving a vulnerable population of mentally ill patients in the city. So he had to be out in the city 2 days a week, and just really turned our lives upside down. And as a result, we established a space outside of the city, but also maintained a different apartment in the city. And this whole experience has brought me to another, deeper level of understanding of myself as highly sensitive, because a question that I get on interviews all the time pre-pandemic is, how can you live in New York City as a person who's highly sensitive? And one of the things I've just come to like know so deeply and clearly about myself is that I am a city person. And there's lots of reasons why, and lots of reasons in terms of how that works for me as a highly sensitive. But I always, really like to emphasize that, especially because again, it's, something that's been front and center for me through this pandemic experience, but also to shatter the stereotypes, right? About what it means to be highly sensitive. Because again, when you really learn how to work with your nervous system, you don't have to be a victim to the world, but you can actually really craft and create your experience in the world in a way that works for you.
Yeah. And you help with that shift in
Yes.
having a more healthy perspective around that, which is
Yeah.
amazing.
Really how to work with your nervous system differently. And it's
Yeah.
totally possible.
Yeah. So you have a place outside of New York City too, because I was going to ask you, my next question too would be like, how are you coping mentally, with I mean, it's going on, right, with COVID, and you're mainly like in, and now there's more spikes happening. So who knows how much more of even more, we're going to go back to more lockdown situation. And, if you're in an apartment in New York City, I was just wondering what kind of things you were doing to stay sane, I guess.
Yeah, I'll say that city life is absolutely 100% impacted, and again, personally for myself, my life was turned upside down. Those first weeks of the pandemic were very, very difficult because of the situation that I described. My husband and I were actually forced to live apart. We were very fortunate to be able to get him very, very quickly a, temporary furnished apartment, but that just made everything so much more difficult. But where we've come now and these months later, and it's just been fascinating to be a part of the experience, is, the city is really in the process of this, amazing experience of creative innovation. And it's one of the reasons why I just love being here. And, here in Manhattan and most other parts of the city, everyone is following the CDC guidelines. So it allows us a flexibility that we didn't have at the beginning when it was just, we were the epicenter. But it's fascinating to just watch like how people are, adaptable. Again, how people are creative, how people pull together and are pulling together as being a part of a community. It's been a really amazing experience to be a part of, again, this, creative innovation. And I feel very, very fortunate and recognize how absolutely privileged I am that we were able to establish a space outside of the city so that we can have a space to go to, retreat, take more, of that quiet time and space. But again, I shouldn't say again in my mind, I've already said this, but saying it for the first time now, that I've been very fortunate to have, really lovely spaces to live in throughout my time in New York City that, I really see as where I'm able to always have, some sacred rejuvenation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. Appreciate it. What the question I wanted to, sorry, as you were talking, my microphone was going in and out, like on the screen blinking. So
Oh, so sorry.
I literally just completely lost my train of thought of where I was going with you. But
Technology distraction.
yeah. Um, do you have, do you have like a favorite? Oh, you know what? Let's go to meditation, because I want to ask you that, your practice.
Yes.
You said, I think it was 6 or 7 years you were in the spiritual guidance world or coaching world, right?
Yes. Well, but
Yes,
I'll keep that in a minute.
no problem. What has that was that an important, necessary piece of your journey to be able to help people the way you do today?
Yes, for sure. So, first and foremost, I'll share that I've been a student of A Course in Miracles, which is a psychological and spiritual curriculum. I've been a student of the course since I was a teenager. My mother passed away when I was 14, and that was one of the tools that I was introduced to. One of the things that my father shared with me to support, that extremely difficult, life-changing event. And so as a student of the course, everything that's at the center that the course teaches is about how to experience a shift in perception. And so when I started my business, as I mentioned earlier, I was fully terrified, and I really turned to my spiritual practice to try to keep myself centered. Again, at that time I didn't understand that I was highly sensitive. And so other practitioners in the wellness world eventually wanted to know what I was doing to be able to have a full practice. And that was one of the things that I started to share. And that's what transitioned into coaching other practitioners to have more of a spiritual approach to business, which then, as I shared, eventually evolved into coaching and mentoring highly sensitives. So, yes, absolutely. That is just a key. I say this, I mean, a spiritual practice is a key part of my life. So it's been a key part of my business, and absolutely still is. And I weave aspects of the course into my training programs, but it's not front and center and foremost. It's there to be used how any member or client chooses that they want to use it.
Do you find your clients, do you find that they obviously, so part of it is you probably share your meditation techniques or how it's helped you or what they can, do you find them leaning towards that and utilizing it in their life after working with you?
I would say yes, because
Most.
again, part of what is needed as a person who's highly sensitive is to learn how to manage your nervous system so that it becomes a tool for you rather than feeling like you are a victim to it. So I teach tools that I refer to as energy management tools. I share grounding, energy activations and centerings as part of just about every single training. And then in regards to meditation, actually one of the members of my coach team, she is a almost lifetime yogi, and she brings a lot of meditation to our community. And then for myself and my own meditation practice, especially throughout these exceptional times of the pandemic, is just really a commitment to sitting down and having that time of meditation in the morning, along with other centering tools that I use as well.
Awesome. What's it look like in the morning for you? How does it, if someone walked in and saw you and were in your brain, what does it look like?
Yeah, morning time is so key for me. I always like to say I need time to readjust to this world. So
Each morning, yeah.
you know,
Oh, I'm back. You wake up, you're like, I'm back. Time to readjust.
exactly. And that's one of the things that I teach too, is that, as a highly sensitive, you're meant to establish a schedule that looks very different than someone who's not highly sensitive. And I know you were actually speaking a little bit to your own schedule before we started recording. And so that classic, you have to start work at 9 and you end at 5. Really? Why? Who decided? And, it's no longer the Industrial Revolution and we have more choices now, and, things like that. So for myself, I personally don't have any verbal or, auditory interaction with team or with clients or with interviews, typically before noon. So I take time. First thing in the morning is always about energy management, meditation, stretching, moving my body. Then I typically go into more, admin work, connecting with the team, showing up on our forums and supporting clients and members. And then I'm kind of ready to be like, oh, okay, now I can sit down and I can have a conversation. I can show up for a mentoring call or to teach or to give an interview, for example.
And that's utilizing your energy in the most proficient way or efficient way.
Oh my gosh. Yes. So I'm really so much about teaching like how to really understand your own circadian rhythm. And when you do, you're really able to get so much done in less time, when you just really understand, how you work best.
Yeah, I follow this individual on Instagram. Of course, there's lots of different personalities you can follow, and one of his things is like wake up and just go to work. Just wake up and just start working. And I tried it, and I'm like, this isn't when I'm most creative. This isn't when I'm like on, and then
Right.
I don't feel great the rest of the day. Um, so yeah, it's everybody's. I don't know what my circadian rhythm is exactly. I did the Ayurveda. Have you heard of Ayurveda?
Of course. Yes.
Yeah. So I had somebody on for that. I read their book and I was like, oh, between 10 and 2 is my time to like shine.
Yes. Yeah.
And it
It's
makes
so
sense.
helpful
I
to
feel it.
know. Exactly. Exactly. But that's such a great example, the person that you're following on Instagram, because again, as I said, when I first started off in business, that's all that was out there, right? It was like, here's the way. And so I did the way, and I was like, this way is killing me. So there's got to be another way.
Yeah, because that can be really discouraging, Heather. That makes sense because especially for somebody that doesn't have the, I would imagine as a sensitive person, you don't have like or one, I don't innately have like, you can fail a million times and be okay with it. You're going to probably be a little bit more sensitive to failure and have to, I don't know, have a different, really, really change your perspective on it, and sit with it longer. So it could discourage somebody like like somebody who's probably like it can impact the world in a major way. And I tell my wife this all the time, like you literally, I try to impact in ways I can with having people like you on my podcast to share and record meditations. And I tell her, I'm like, you were like truly believe, and I don't force anything on her, but I'm like, I believe that you were like meant to change the lives of like millions of people.
Hmm.
I do, and I believe that truly because of how caring she is and how again sensitive she
Right.
is to people. And but that is also the thing I believe that holds somebody like that back from needing to quote unquote spotlight, right? Be in the spotlight or whatever. But I don't know. Who am I? I'm just kind of like talking what
Yeah,
I
no, but
see.
you're really spot on, because again, it's just everything about the work that I do. And especially now with what we're experiencing in our world, I really believe that as highly sensitives, like we have so much that we're meant to be bringing to the world right now. If the pandemic, in my opinion, has taught us nothing else, it has taught us that we are meant to change the way that we have been doing things. And as highly sensitives, we really truly are meant to lead the way. So if it's about, again, how you're showing up in your family, how you're showing up in a business, how you're showing up in a boardroom, we are really meant to step forward. So you can send her my way, and I
I
will
think
happily support her.
I'm
And
gonna I'm definitely like I don't make her listen to any of my episodes, right? She just, if she wants to listen, she can, right? I'm not like you have to, but this one I'm going to be like, Catherine, honey, I love you. And if you don't listen to this episode, I'm going to tie you down and put it in your, because I think it's really important. I think it's so, um,
everything,
it's,
it
it's
really,
so cool. It's eye opening for me. So I can only imagine, for someone like that, someone like herself. And I'm sure she's heard of this before, or maybe hasn't. I don't know. Uh, it just reminds me of once you can crack that like as anybody, right? It doesn't matter whether you're highly sensitive or not. Once you can look inside and crack something open, like the sky, like the old saying, the sky is the limit. You can tap into your zone of genius, what I
great.
like to say.
Yes,
uh,
absolutely. Yes,
and
truly. Again, however each one of us is meant to show up,
yeah,
right? But it changes everything.
right,
It changes how you, again, as we've talked about, changes how you show up in your relationships, changes how you show up as a parent, it changes how you show up as a colleague, it changes how you show up within a job, it changes how you just show up in the day to day. And for so many highly sensitives, again, the world can feel so imprisoning, and it just doesn't need to be that way.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Heather, for being on here. This was a great conversation.
It was. I so appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, someone like yourself, I want to ask this last question. If you can go back and tell your 18-year-old self anything and they would listen, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, that is an important question. So when I was 18, I was really, really struggling, really so much difficulty. Again, my mother had just died, 4 years earlier.
Right.
So what I would tell that 18-year-old is I would tell her that everything that feels so dark and so difficult right now is actually going to become exactly what you need in order to be able to change not only your life and your experience, but the lives and experience of so many others. This is happening on purpose, and you will be okay.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. Thank you. All right. I will press stop now.